We're Karen and Beaux Christensen, a Danish-American couple who met in Germany in 2016. Beaux is an airline pilot, and Karen is a freelance advertising creative director. In late 2022, we bought Château de la Tuileries in Martel, France, and are working to make it a bed and breakfast and wedding destination fit for a queen. Welcome to Queen's Escape.
Today we're visiting Rocamadour, and it's an old, maybe 1,000-year-old city. It's known as the City of Miracles, and people come here on pilgrimage. It used to be one of the main pilgrimage sites where people would stop, and there's how many steps?
216.
Yes, so there's 216 steps. And pilgrims used to climb these steps on their knees, and they would do that to reenact and empathize with the pain that Christ felt as he was carrying the cross in his last days. But it's very steep and very high, and it's also very beautiful, but it's a city built into the side of a cliff, and it features the Black Virgin, which is a famous Mary statue. And we just sat in a service where we were doing chants. Anyway, it's a hot day. It's, I think, 97 degrees today, and we chose this day to climb the steps here at Rocamadour.
Rocamadour, a Marian city related to the Blessed Virgin Mary, fourth place of Christian pilgrimage in the world after Rome, Jerusalem, and the Holy Santiago de Compostela. On the southern fringes of the Massif Central, the Cause de Gramat rises out of the ground about 300 meters high. It has rivers running along the edges which have carved out deep valleys with sheer cliffs. The xxoo is Rocamadour's river, and it has formed an impressive canyon with a gorge some 100 meters deep. The side of the valley stretches for about 1 kilometer from northeast to the southwest and is indented with several entrances into grottos or caverns. According to cave paintings in the area, these caverns were occupied by prehistoric men and women dating back to 25 to 30,000 BC. Specialists tell us that many of these caverns were Paleolithic country churches. One of these such caves is known as the Grotto of the Black Virgin, and this cavern became the heart of Rocamadour. In this little cave, it is said that the image of the Virgin has been on view since the dawn of time. Its age is roughly 12th century, and the way it is made puts it among the priceless treasures of the 300 Black Virgins that the West can boast of. It is small, just 68 centimeters, carved from a walnut trunk and hollowed out at the back to house some unidentified relics. She is shown sitting on a seat suggestive of the seat of wisdom. The child Jesus, with a miniature adult face, is sitting, apparently unaided, on her left knee. She is not wearing a veil, unlike many of the other Virgin statues. A simple gold collar enhances her dress with its modest folds and lack of adornment. The crown, carved from wood, but mutilated to support a golden diadem that was later stolen, makes the disproportionate size of her head stand out. Mary presents Jesus and fearlessly offers him to the visitor rather than putting herself in the forefront as the handmaid of the Lord. We find no indication in any documentation that the statue of the Virgin of Rocamadour was originally black. The Book of Miracles, dated 1172, mentions only that there were many wax offerings and burning candles at the feet of the statue. Could the smoke have blackened the walnut from which it was carved and was already naturally dark? The statue was covered with silver plate, like similar statues of the time. It was perhaps taken down, mistreated, hidden, or buried in the ground to escape pillage. The question remains open despite many speculations and esoteric theories about the secret of the Black Virgins. Top 4 things to see at Rocamadour are the Black Virgin, Roland's sword, the miraculous bell, and the medieval churches and art. Alongside the rock that has been there for thousands of years, the statue of the Virgin is the only really ancient thing that remains in this place. It has been moved from its original rock slab at the base of the rock face and now sits on a 19th century altar inside the Chapelle Notre-Dame de Rocamadour, or Notre Dame Chapel. Make seeing the Black Virgin a priority when you visit Rocamadour. Roland's sword is another must-see, and the story of this famous sword is where we start our history of Rocamadour, even though the tale is widely regarded as legend rather than truth. Roland's famous sword, Durandal. According to La Chanson de Roland, or the Song of Roland, the sword was brought by an angel to Charlemagne, who was at the Vale of Marian. And Charlemagne then gave it to Roland, a Frankish knight who was also his nephew. In that poem, the sword is said to contain within its golden hilt a tooth of St. Peter, blood of Basil of Caesarea, hair of St. Denis, and a piece of the clothing of Mary, mother of Jesus. It was said to be the sharpest sword in all existence, capable of cutting through giant boulders of stone with a single strike, and was indestructible. The sword is mentioned in numerous writings and poems, including the epic poem Orlando Innamorato, or Roland in Love, by Italian Renaissance author Boiardo, who traces the sword's origin all the way back to Hector of Troy. The story is that Roland's sword is embedded in the rock at the precipice of Rocamadour and has been there for 9 centuries. Roland died at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass on the 15th of August 788 by attack of the Basques. Some stories suggest that after being defeated and as he lay dying, Roland tried to destroy the sword so his enemies wouldn't get it, but he could not. So he positioned his body on top of the sword, trying to hide it. The location where he supposedly tried to destroy the sword is called Roland's Breach. 12th century monks of Rocamadour claim Roland, rather than hiding it beneath himself, in a great effort, threw the sword more than 100 kilometers, creating a crevice due to its sharpness in the wall. The reason there is a plausible connection between Roland, the sword Durandal, and Rocamadour lies in the fact that it was precisely from Rocamadour that Roland departed with his troops to cross the Pyrenees Mountains. The monks probably invented the story as a means of propaganda. They were not unaware that many other places claimed to have the same sword. Another legend in Rocamadour claims that the true Durandal was deposited in the chapel of Mary there, but was stolen by Henry the Young King in 1183, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine's son with Henry II, King of England. They're all mythical stories with little or no historical or archaeological basis. Nonetheless, embedded in the rock at the precipice of Rocamadour above the buildings of the sanctuary is the sword that is called Roland's sword. Many sources say that for 9 centuries it's been there, held in place by a chain. It's not known where the sword actually came from. In 2011, the town council removed the sword of Rocamadour from the cliff for the first time and gave it to the Cluny Museum in Paris to be exhibited. The real Durandal sword can be seen in the Royal Armoury of Madrid. Aside from the legend of Roland's sword that supposedly dates back from 788 AD and the scientific dating of the Black Virgin statue in the 12th century, the earliest known history of Rocamadour begins in the 11th century. The Church of Rocamadour was donated to the Benedictine monks of Marcillac-sur-Célé in 1030 by Dieudonné, Bishop of Cahors. The monks owned more than 100 priories at the time. Being so rich, they lost interest in it. We read the first mention of a devotion to the Virgin Mary along with a pilgrimage in the bull of Pope Paschal II. This papal bull stated that the important pilgrimage shrine at Rocamadour would be acquired by the Abbey of Toul. Legal proceedings between the two groups of monks lasted until 1193. Despite the legal back and forth, the new monks, Benedictine monks of Saint-Marcin-du-Toul, displayed energy and a sense of opportunity and dynamism, as represented in their leader, Géraud d'Escorval, who presided over Rocamadour from 1152 to 1188. The abbot of Saint-Marcin-de-Toul organized and developed the pilgrimage. The monks were the masters and spiritual managers of the pilgrimage. They added a more commercial activity to the proceedings thanks to the grip they had on the production of badges. Badges were insignia in molded lead that depicted the seal of the monks with the Virgin enthroned with a mandorla. They could be sewn onto a piece of clothing because they had small rings at the edges and could be acquired outside the sanctuaries. They authenticated the fact that a person was a genuine Rocamadour pilgrim. The badges were reported to have miraculous healing powers. In response to the popularity of pilgrimages, the area around Rocamadour was developed because, as well as roads, pilgrims needed shelters which sprung up all along the principal routes. The Camino de Santiago, or Santiago de Compostela, pilgrimage predated the Rocamadour pilgrimage by a century and therefore had a strong influence. Traditionally, as with most pilgrimages, the Way of St. James begins at one's home and ends at the pilgrimage site. Lots of pilgrims who came from the north on their way to the Cathedral de Santiago de Compostela in Galicia made a detour to Rocamadour, encouraging the growth of hospitals and safe shelters. In 1159, the Plantagenet Henry II of England, husband to our French Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, went to pray at Rocamadour and returned again also in 1170. Such famous visits helped establish the pilgrimage's fame. There are no documents from the site that describe the beginning of the work started by Géraud d'Escorval, but it was in 1160 that he started works on the Saint-Michel Chapel or St. Michael Chapel, the St. Amador Crypt, and the St. Sauveur Church. It would take about a century to complete them, and today they're the three remaining medieval structures that you can see. It's unknown whether Géraud was responding to an influx of pilgrims to the cathedral or if his efforts created the influx of pilgrims. Outside the Saint-Michel Chapel, there is a dilapidated painting above the door, Saint Michael, the Archangel. We see the same angel who weighs souls inside the chapel, where there is a 13th century painting which adorns the little apse. He is with another angel at the feet of Christ in majesty, surrounded by a mandorla and flanked by the four evangelists. Hence the name of this chapel, Saint Michel or Saint Michael. This room was the oratory of the monks and then later of the canons, who would get a good view from there of the entrance of the chapel. As you enter the Notre Dame chapel to visit the Black Virgin, look up and over to your left at the little apse of the Saint Michel Chapel. Just beneath the three arcades, and you'll see paintings done by a 12th century artist portraying the principal mysteries of Mary's life. On the left is the Annunciation, with the angel Gabriel reaching out to her with a greeting written on a flag that says, "Hail Mary." On the right, we see the Visitation. This is where Mary is finishing her journey in peace, while Elizabeth, her cousin and mother of John the Baptist, runs toward her to clasp her in her arms. The paintings are in a state of exceptional preservation. Some guides claim that no one has ever restored them, and whether this is true or not, the painting is definitely protected from the wind and the rain thanks to the overhanging cliff. The Saint-Michel Chapel and its annexes only represent a tiny part of the building program set in motion by Géraud d'Escorval. His was a monumental concept, and you can feel it when you approach Rocamadour by car and are awestruck upon first seeing it. An impressive wall, 30 meters long and 30 meters wide, rises from a recess in the side of the cliff. Romanesque openings with strong buttresses propping it up. This supports two churches, one on top of the other. The lower church can be reached through a narrow opening in the side of the cliff and a stairway with 30 steps that goes down from the square. It bears the name of ʁɔkamaduʁ crypt. It was connected and at the same level of the original grotto or cavern that housed the Black Virgin. It has a cistern that was indispensable in times of drought or siege. Robert de Tournai, abbot of Mont Saint-Michel, wrote in 1186, "In the year of our Lord's incarnation, 1166, a man from the area was coming towards the end of his life and asked his family, no doubt under God's inspiration, to bury his body at the entrance of the oratory. While digging out the earth, they came across the body of ʁɔkamaduʁ in very good condition. They placed it in the church near the altar, and it is shown in its intact state to the pilgrims." This is where the lower church gets its name, Crypt of ʁɔkamaduʁ. Many people think Rocamadour was named for ʁɔkamaduʁ, but in fact it's the other way around. The body of the named ʁɔkamaduʁ borrowed from the place of its discovery, Rocamadour. Some people say that ʁɔkamaduʁ was the manservant of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and that he sometimes had the honor of carrying and feeding the Lord. Above the ʁɔkamaduʁ crypt was built the large Saint Sauveur Church, or the Saint Savior Church. This church became a minor basilica in 1913. It is admired by medievalists since it is a contemporary with the great Gothic churches of northern France. Rocamadour was known as the City of Miracles. Possibly Giraud's idea was to circulate a compilation that reported 126 exceptional phenomena which took place at Rocamadour through the intercession of the Virgin Mary. This became the Book of Miracles of Notre Dame de Rocamadour, dated 1172. The book was considered to be of exceptional quality. Clearness of style, liveliness of the accounts were a first-rate literary piece. The deserved success of this collection relayed and extended the fame of the sanctuary of Rocamadour. The book gives us a lot of information about medieval life. The original is kept at the National Library in Paris. It contained miracles of all kinds. There are rescues at sea, conversions of thieves, healings of the demon-possessed, prisoners freed from their irons, etc. Our Lady is attentive to all requests. The current-day chapel of Notre Dame houses what's known as the miraculous bell. It dates from before the 9th century and is of a very rare type in that it was forged and not cast, with no stock but with a sort of handle to hang it from the vault. It's special not just because of its age. It also is known to bear witness to the protection of Mary, the star of the sea for sailors in peril. Miracle rescues at sea were said to be signaled by the ringing of the bell. A plaque indicates the dates on which the bell has rung on its own when Mary's intercession was sought. Along with the Black Virgin and Roland's sword, the miraculous bell and the medieval churches are two of the 4 not-to-be-missed items at Rocamadour. About the time that the monks were 10 years into their renovation and the Book of Miracles was being edited, one of our special queens paid a visit. In 1172, Eleanor of Aquitaine visited Rocamadour. 36 years after taking over, a legal agreement was formed between the abbeys of Marcillac-sur-Celle and Saint-Martin-de-Toul. The Toul Benedictines would keep possession of Rocamadour. About 50 years into the construction that took a century to complete, we have the start of the crusade against the Albigensians, also known as the Cathars. The Albigensian Crusade, or the Cathar Crusade, was a military and ideological campaign initiated by Pope Innocent III to eliminate Catharism in what is now southern France. The crusade was prosecuted primarily by the French crown. Pope Innocent offered the lands of the Cathar heretics to any French nobleman willing to take up arms. All discernible traces of the Cathar movement were eradicated by the middle of the 14th century. Some historians consider the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars an act of genocide. During its first years of existence, and because of how it was built, the sanctuary was naturally protected and relatively safe. In the 13th century, multiple conflicts emerged and a defensive building was created, leading up from a closet in the sacristy, a storage room for sacred items and books, a secret passage forbidden to the public, a staircase cut into the cliff which overlooks the sanctuaries leads up to the castle on the cliff inside the 14th century ramparts. The ramparts made it possible to protect Rocamadour from above and provided a passage to water in the cistern of the St. Amador crypt. Just as there were internal religious struggles between Catholicism and the Cathars, further south, a battle for what is now Spain was kicking off. In the year 1212, Spain did not exist. There were Spains, numerous small kingdoms which squabble between themselves and which all undergo the occupation of the Moors. All these kingdoms are Christian and only agree on one point: to kick the Muslims out of their territories. To defeat the invaders in Spain, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade which gathered a massive army. Alfonso VIII of Castile, nicknamed the Little King, took the lead of the crusade against the Moors launched by Pope Innocent III. In his party were the kings of the Spains and the great lords of the south of France, the bishops and other priors, all mobilized to converge on Castile, then Andalusia. There was at Rocamador a religious sacristan, or a person in charge of sacristy of religious artifacts and equipment, to whom the Blessed Virgin appeared 3 Saturdays in succession, holding a folded flag and ordering him to carry it to the little King of Spain, who was to fight the tribes of Arabia. The sexton pleaded not to do the task because he didn't think it was important enough to be believed. The price of his resistance was a sign of death on the 3rd day. The sexton monk died after making this revelation known to the prior. Then the prior received the charge of fulfilling the mandate, to which he was added the order not to unfurl the flag before the day of the battle, nor before the time of a pressing necessity. The prior of Rocamador faithfully executed the mandate and went himself to the field of battle. The flag bore the image of the Blessed Virgin Mary holding her child in her arms. The Christians launched the offensive at dawn on Monday, July 16, 1212. Just as all seemed lost, in the heart of the battle, the banner of the Virgin Maria of Rocamador was deployed on the orders of King Alphonse of Castile. This image of the protection of the Virgin is said to galvanize the troops who crush the Moors. On the battlefield, covered with innumerable corpses, the Spanish armies gather and sing, by order of the Archbishop of Toledo, a Te Deum of thanksgiving to God for this victory, which all attribute to the intervention miracle of Our Lady of Rocamador. While the body of Saint Amador had been discovered and named at the beginning of the 12th century, no one knew anything about him, who he was, how he got there, but that didn't stop the storyteller Geoffroy de Paris from making it up in the 13th century. In Geoffroy's story, Amador was the hero of a beautiful legend. Herod's followers were pursuing Jesus into Egypt, and as they passed by a farm with full-grown wheat and asked about Jesus, they were told that Jesus was there when the wheat was planted. This disheartened Herod's followers because they believed they must be far behind Jesus. But in fact, the wheat sown by Jesus during the flight into Egypt miraculously sprang up immediately. Geoffroy claimed that the master of this miraculous field was Saint Amador, who then became friends with Mary. Where today a long street is filled with shops, restaurants, and inns, in the 13th century, the village was born in a desolate spot on the banks of the xxoo River, out of the need to feed and house the pilgrims. The prosperity of the artisans and owners of the houses and inns attracted thieves and bands of plunderers. There are 6 gates, more or less reshaped from the original defensive system. They allow the village, which extends along a single street, to be divided into less exposed sections. The names of the gates are the Hospital Gate, the Fig Tree Gate, Solomon's Gate, the Hugon Gate, the Lower Gate, and the Caballera Gate. Toul Abbey achieved its status as diocese under Pope John XXII. The monks were then replaced by canons who would assure that the pilgrimage was serviced. The pilgrimage reached its peak in the 13th century. In the 14th century, as the village was forming and the monks departing, Saint Amador had another backstory bestowed upon him. In this legend, the Dominican Bertrand Guy made Saint Amador the husband of Saint Veronica, who was a close friend of Mary, mother of Jesus. It is so faded you may not notice it, but on the wall, below the fresco paintings of Mary, is a huge painting of St. Christopher from the 14th century, with a mysterious child, supposedly Jesus himself, is on his shoulders. His most famous legend tells that he carried a child who was unknown to him across a river before the child revealed himself as Christ. Therefore, he is the patron saint of travelers, and small images of him are often worn around the neck, on a bracelet, carried in a pocket, or placed in vehicles by Christians. Saint Christopher was worshipped in France as early as the 6th century. His association with protecting travelers stems from his legend. In the medieval period, images of Saint Christopher were very often found painted on the north wall of small churches, opposite the south door entrance. This was because of the belief that viewing his image would protect you from sudden illness or death for the rest of the day. He is the protector of travelers and pilgrims. The absence of the left side of the fresco reminds us of the serious landslide of the rock which destroyed the Notre Dame chapel and took away this piece of the wall. The 100 Years' War was a significant conflict in the Middle Ages. For 116 years, interrupted by several truces, 5 generations of kings from 2 rival dynasties fought for the throne of France, which was then the dominant kingdom of Western Europe. The former Quercy province in which Rocamadour sits became a battlefield for the supporters of the King of England and those of the King of France. Rocamadour's decline came about due to the scarcity of pilgrims caused by the troubles and insecurity. It was transformed into a fortress, and fortifications were strengthened. The bubonic plague pandemic, known as the Black Death, reached France by ship from Italy to Marseille in November 1347, spread first through southern France and then continued onward towards northern France. The Black Death was the second great natural disaster to strike Europe during the late Middle Ages, the first one being the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and is estimated to have killed 30 to 60% of the European population. The Kingdom of France had the largest population of Europe at the time, and the Black Death was a major catastrophe. The migration of the plague caused panic across France, and people started looking for scapegoats. Rumors started to spread that the plague was caused by people who poisoned the wells to cause the plague and exterminate Christendom. Initially, these accusations weren't directed at people of any particular category, but directed at anyone who appeared suspicious, simply because they were different or unidentified, particularly travelers, such as pilgrims and beggars, invalids, or people in possession of any kind of powder. In the middle of the 100 Years' War in 1427, Pope Martin V issued a bull, or official papal letter, which identified Saint Amador with Zacchaeus. And this story of Saint Amador is the version that was chosen in 1889 for the chapel's altar. The 100 Years' War between the French and the English was still raging, and there was also a civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Charles VII's father, Charles VI, had disinherited him and recognized Henry V of England as his successor. Charles VII, often called the Little King of Beaux, had lost most of the royal lands. Part of the problem was that he wasn't officially king or even recognized as the heir. He couldn't force a coronation because the Burgundians held the city in which French kings were traditionally crowned. In those dark years, Charles did not shine through either his political sense or his tactical sense. He was just the poor king of Beaux. But little by little, Charles VII was able to begin the work of reunifying the kingdom by rallying the people's loyalty to himself as the legitimate king. A bit more than a century earlier, there was great suffering caused by wars and diseases such as the plague and all kinds of ills. And among the people, there was a great desire to return to a more holy way of living. So with great faith, the Christians determined to travel on foot to Rome to pray at the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul and to receive the Pope's blessing in order to obtain the grace and strength to carry on. They came in their thousands at Christmas in 1299. Due to their great number, the Pope, full of admiration for their faith, proclaimed a year of forgiveness of all sins. This year of forgiveness became a tradition in the Roman Catholic Church called a Jubilee. So in 1427, with the country in a similar period of unhappiness, Charles VII appealed to Pope Martin V. He asked to grant special indulgences to pilgrims who had been to Rocamadour. At that time, many villages near Cahors were occupied by the English, but despite the 100-Year War, pilgrimage to Rocamadour was respected by both armies, the French and the English, so the choice of this sanctuary was reasonable. By a bull dispatched in 1427, a right of indulgence was attributed to the Bishop of Cahors in favor of a grand pardon at the sanctuary of Rocamador. The Grand Pardon de Rocamador became a Jubilee tradition, still kept since 1428 at the sanctuary. Presided over by the Bishop of Cahors, this religious event offers to the Catholic faithful an exceptional indulgence. Along with the goodwill established by the institution of the Great Pardon at Rocamadour, requested by Charles and approved by the Pope, things improved further with the appearance of Joan of Arc. Partway through the 15th century, the ancient rock cavern that originally housed the Black Madonna collapsed. After the collapse in 1476, Denis de Bar, Bishop of Toul, who was responsible for the shrine, had a more ample chapel built in 1479. Its commemorative inscription remains embedded in the wall, and the entrance door, which is flamboyant Gothic in style, also survives. The sculptures above the tympanum link virtuosity with humor by depicting, instead of the traditional acanthus, which is a flowering plant, a symbol of immortality and rebirth, different types of curled up vegetables that a lizard and a snail have their eyes on. The Annunciation is shown with Saint Joseph at the bottom of the tableau. The piece can be dated by the coat of arms of Denis de Bar and his successor Clément de Briac. The sword and below the famous iron-bound chest with a legendary lock was put in place. In front of the Notre Dame chapel, the offering chest dating from the Middle Ages reminds us of the magnitude of the crowds that flocked to Rocamadour and probably the Great Pardons. The 15th century iron-bound chest, which is found below the paintings of Mary and St. Christopher, continues to seek the pilgrim's generosity. A local book about Rocamadour shares that at first the sword was lodged in the wall opposite the entrance of the oratory, but then later it was moved high up in a fissure of the rock because, along with the lock from the iron-bound chest that was situated below it, it gave rise to some rather undesirable fertility rites, which the monks put an end to by moving it. We don't think just touching the sword would be considered a rather undesirable fertility rite, but we cannot find any more details about what people might have been doing to that sword and the lock of the chest to gain fertility. A postcard text reads, "Any girl's finger that touches the heroic and savage sword attracts a wedding ring." On the Gothic side of the chapel, a fragment of a 15th century painting is to be found. Two emaciated corpses, almost in the state of skeletons, are represented full length, almost life-size. The first, armed with a shovel and wearing a shroud over his shoulders, raises his left arm, while the second brandishes a javelin with the same hand. The leg of the third corpse can still be guessed. Above the dead remains the representation of a trinity in the clouds that have now almost disappeared. A large part of the composition disappeared during the drilling of a bay. Time and the weather are slowly eroding away the paint, but they remain plainly visible. This takes its inspiration from the tale of the three dead and the three living, which calls to mind the fragility of every man and woman, rich or poor, young or old. They are some of France's earliest known external paintings. The scene was certainly made around 1479 when the Notre Dame chapel was rebuilt. The story is that three young noblemen are out hunting when they suddenly come across three corpses, which are in varying states of decay, but nonetheless still animated. Unsurprisingly, the young men express shock and dismay at the sight, while the three corpses admonish them to consider the transience of life and to improve their behavior before it's too late. The theme is in harmony with the anxiety or even anguish of that period, which saw the Black Death. The Romanesque building was in fact destroyed in 1476, when a section of the cliff against which the city leaned fell. It's in this church that very early on the body of Saint Amador that never decayed was laid to rest. Sadly, his body did not survive the decline of the pilgrimages, since it was burned by the Protestants in 1562. From the early months of these wars, the Rocamadour pilgrimage found itself under attack from Protestants. and a large quantity of precious objects disappeared. The only thing to be salvaged was the statue of the Black Virgin. Many robberies and fires occurred, altering buildings and constructions. The defenses of the castle on top of the cliff were quite useful during the religious wars of the 13th century. With the Renaissance period, wars stopped, and the defenses were not useful anymore. During the 17th century, the Christ was created and placed in the middle of the paved area. The wood of the cross is fashioned from a living tree, offering a sign of healing and hope. The Christ was moved, and you can see it today above the new altar. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea of pilgrimage began to be heavily criticized. Rocamador still maintained a strong influence, even when pastors weren't pushing for pilgrimages as much anymore. In 1666, a year of the Great Pardon, an enormous crowd of some 15,000 to 20,000 people descended upon Rocamador. They gave them communion in a large meadow. During the 18th century, walnut paneling was added around the new altar in the Saint-Sauveur church. The French Revolution had a dramatic and devastating impact on Rocamador. Because they represented wealth, privilege, and resistance to change, religious institutions were targeted. The revolution sought to dismantle old power structures, and the church was one of the biggest. The churches and chapels at Rocamador were closed, vandalized, and many religious artifacts were confiscated or destroyed. The Black Madonna, which had drawn pilgrims for centuries, may have been desecrated, but ultimately it survived. The Benedictine monks who had cared for the site for centuries were expelled. Pilgrimage activity stopped entirely during the Revolution. The sanctuary and associated buildings fell into disrepair, and Rocamador, once a bustling spiritual hub, became almost deserted. With the Concordat of 1801, which was an agreement between Napoleon Bonaparte and Pope Pius VII, the structure of the Catholic Church in France was reorganized, and the Bishop of Cahors, Claude de Berthier, became responsible for Rocamador. At the beginning of the 19th century, the religious city of Rocamador was in a very sad state. Trees were growing on the grand staircase. Most of the shopkeepers had left. 3 sanctuaries were in service, the Saint-Sauveur and Saint-Amador churches and the Notre Dame chapel. 2 are in poor condition, Saint-Michel and Saint-Blaise, and other 2 are ruined, Saint-Anne and Saint-Jean-Baptiste. The roof of the Saint-Sauveur church had to be redone. The exterior wall of the south side had an overhang of 30 centimeters under the pressure of the vaults overloaded with rubble. It was a priest from Paris, Father Caillou, a one-time missionary in Quercy, who came to rest in Rocamador in 1821, who would begin the restoration of the pilgrimage with the purchase of the ruin that dominated the site on the cliff. With the Romantic movement, an artistic and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century, the Gothic and Middle Ages became fashionable again. Little by little, a political will was born in France for the conservation of historical monuments. A part of Romanticism was an idealization of the past as a nobler era. At the same time, society rediscovered the Middle Ages and pilgrimage. This explains why a distinguished ecclesiastic from the upper bourgeoisie took on the mission of relaunching the Rocamador pilgrimage. The abbot Caillou was a priest and was miraculously cured in the 19th century. He gave his fortune to the Black Virgin Mary of Rocamador. He bought the ramparts at the top of the cliff in 1840. Only the ramparts remained of the 14th century fortress that defended the shrine below. From the first half of the 19th century, there was a certain awareness of the architectural emergencies for monuments that had been neglected for a long time and which risked disappearing in a short time. A list of monuments was drawn up for the lot. The chapel of Rocamador appeared as a priority, but no funding was granted by the state or by the municipality of Rocamador. Known for his devotion to Our Lady of Rocamadour, Father Bonhomme turned to her after he had completely lost his voice while preaching a retreat. He was miraculously healed and managed to complete the retreat. On September 12, 1832, Father Bonhomme was appointed pastor of the Church of Our Lady of Gramat. Every year on Easter Monday, a real crowd headed to Rocamadour. Rocamadour's sanctuary was abandoned. Father Bonhomme saw with sadness the desert and the ruin of that place, whose glory had been so great in the centuries of faith. He often went on foot to the sanctuary and prayed at the feet of the Black Virgin. Soon he was no longer alone. Groups of parishioners accompanied him. We can say that Father Bonhomme took an active part in the movement to restore pilgrimages to the sanctuary of Rocamadour. In kind language, he said that to make a good pilgrimage, 3 things were necessary: love of God and Mary in the heart, rain or snow on the back, and fatigue in the legs. From the start, Caillou was helped in his task by Pierre Bonhomme. They organized retreats. By doing so, they progressively gave a new life to the pilgrimage. After 10 years dedicated to the renewal and evangelization of the countryside in 1848, Bonhomme lost his voice and had to give up preaching. The Bishop of Cahors, Jean-Jacques David Bardot, bought the castle from the abbot Caillou. He had the present castle built in Tuscan style to serve as a residence for diocesan missionaries. 6 years earlier, in 1844, Bardot sent a letter to the wife of Louis-Philippe, Marie-Amélie de Bourbon, daughter of Ferdinand IV, King of Naples, to obtain funds to repair the steps of the grand staircase. The sanctuaries were in ruins, so it was a big surprise to local senior officials that money could be acquired to repair the stairs ahead of the sanctuaries. In the 19th century, a building with the name Mary's House was used as a lodging place. Rebuilt from 1852 to 1856, it took the place of a former hermitage. Jean-Baptiste Cheval is a French priest, architect, painter, archaeologist who restored numerous religious buildings in the south of France, notably the sanctuaries of Rocamador. He belonged to the Viollet-le-Duc school, for whom restoring a building is not about maintaining it, repairing it, or redoing it, but about re-establishing it completely in a condition in which it could never have existed previously. Cheval carried out administrative tasks, supply of machines and materials, cash management, purchase of land, negotiation, and representation of the bishop in court. He reported to the bishop almost every month on the progress of the work and the expenses incurred. He devoted himself fully to his task despite health problems. He even made advances with his personal assets when money ran out for the construction site. He was very affected by the hostility of the population of Rocamador. He also fell significantly from a scaffolding August of 1872. Information for the restoration in the 1800s will often be incomplete because the municipal archives for the 19th century were deliberately destroyed in the very first years of the 20th century in completely mysterious circumstances. First restoration campaign from 1858 to 1864 concerned the Saint Sauveur Church. Stained glass windows were added at this time. When Father Cheval undertook the restoration of the Notre Dame Chapel and decided to double its surface space and to raise it in order to maintain its balance, he kept the entrance door and a section of the wall that supported the paintings of the meeting of the 3 dead and the 3 living, the holy water font, and some small Gothic cupboards. The miraculous chapel was almost entirely rebuilt from 1858 onwards. After Father Cheval's restorations, a huge statue of the Virgin was hoisted up into the south corner. Dedicated more to the devotion of the faithful than to the celebration of the liturgy, the Chapel of the Virgin would provide a home for all objects, or ex votos. These were objects of thanksgiving that people would give to the church after a granted wish. In the past, ex-votos were offered and placed in places of worship. The model boats attest to the same attitude of trust. The irons and shackles hanging on the rock, they are mementos of freed prisoners or of pardoned sinners. Most ex-votos are dated within the 19th century. The tapestry that hangs behind the present altar was similarly a gift from the ladies of Rocamadour around 1890. The St. Amador crypt was cleared, having also served as a place of burial, and the cistern opened to become a sacristy. The St. Anne Chapel was entirely rebuilt on the covered way and received a 15th century doorway coming from the monastery of the Ladies of Malta at Beaux Hospital. It houses the 17th century altarpiece that prior to 1890 was situated in the Chapel of the Black Virgin. Part of this contains a wooden gilt bas-relief whose movement and sensibility represent Mary, her presence hidden by a cloud, suggesting the Assumption. February 3rd, 1865, the land of the valley north of the churches suddenly broke away and began to tumble with a terrible crash onto the barn and cellar of the innkeeper Jean-Louis Lafont. Then came a long period of arm wrestling between the commune and the pilgrimage. Although we don't have a lot of information about it, we know that in 1865, the Saint-Michel Chapel was restored. The Lantern of the Dead was restored, and the St. Blaise Chapel, whose foundations are medieval, was consolidated with its 13th century doorway. And the last phase of the project concerns the Abbey Palace and Saint Jean Baptiste between 1869 and 1872. The largest and most visible of the restorations undertaken by Father Cheval is what is known as the Palace of the Bishops. The foundations date from the 13th and 14th centuries. A cistern has been built there. Today, this palace is used as an exhibition hall for the Francis Poulenc Museum. The Saint-Jean-Baptiste Chapel, the gift of some local nobles, was entirely modified, keeping only its 15th century doorway. Also around the year of 1872, the architect Cheval was thrown from a scaffold. The account reads, "He only saved himself by a miracle." This fall, however, was not harmless for him. He felt his normal strength affected. He even had to leave Rocamadour and retire to Montauban with a group of devoted friends. In 1887, a way of the cross was marked out in the former lush and shaded quarry, leading to a majestic cavalry in stone. The Great Stairway, or Grand Escalier, was reset again in 1890. The northern door of the sanctuaries, known as the St. Martial Gate, was redone and bears the arms of Manager Guimardis. Manager Inard, who was the Bishop of Cahors, he set up the statue of St. Martial. People say that the statue bears his facial features. Francis Poulenc, the world-renowned composer, found the major inspiration for his religious music in Rocamadour. He composed the litanies of the Black Virgin of Rocamadour for choir of women or children and organ, based on the words of a litany printed on the back of a simple holy picture card. Around 1900, the north exit from the sanctuaries was built into an esplanade and today is dedicated to Edmond Michelet. In 1913, the Saint Saviour Church received the title of minor basilica. Minor basilicas are those churches throughout Christendom that have been given a special designation by the Holy Father. Reasons for bestowing this designation may be granted for architectural beauty, historical significance, liturgical renown, or for any combination of these attributes. In 1930, a window featuring the Good Shepherd is placed on the new altar, orienting the whole arrangement of the monument towards the east in accordance with tradition. A parvis is a vacant enclosed area in front of a church. Today, the parvis at Rocamadour is surrounded by 5 churches or chapels. Add the Miraculous Chapel and the St. Michel Chapel, and we reach the number 7, a symbol of perfection or plenitude. The cliff at 50 meters high looks resplendent in the morning sun. Another symbolic Rocamadour monument remains the principal means of access. It currently boasts 216 steps, and both its shape and setting have hardly changed. Along with everyday use, it also served a frequently required penitential role, gathering voluntary and mandatory penitents together in the village street, and then freeing them on the square after they had climbed up the hundreds of steps, no doubt on their knees. Going up on one's knees, currently accompanied by the recitation of the Hail Mary, has continued up to this day from the more fervent or younger pilgrims. Tourists became commonplace in Rocamadour around 1880 with the opening of the railway line from Paris to Toulouse, and their arrival does not always appear to have been welcomed. The visitors or pilgrims since the 1980s are very diverse and tend to reflect a global spread. However, the mixture maintains a strong European flavor. Bonhomme was beatified by Pope John Paul II on March 20th, 2003. In the center of the Upper Quercy region, the small sacred city of Rocamadour, hanging on to the edge of its impressive cliff 150 meters high, dominates the pleasant valley of Alzou. Situated 54 kilometers from Brive and 59 kilometers from Cahors, Rocamadour is easily accessible. Discover Rocamadour early in the day as the morning light shows the site at its best. The houses over the stream, the churches over the houses, the rocks over the churches, and the castle over the rocks.